Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Tent Intruder. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. 4 college friends, Emily, Jake, Laura, and Ben, had driven deep into the forests of Oregon, eager to escape the city and reconnect with nature. The area was remote, miles away from the nearest town, and they had set up camp by a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines. The first day was filled with laughter, hiking, and campfire stories. As the sun set and darkness engulfed the forest, they crawled into their tents, tired but content. The night was eerily quiet. No crickets chirped, no rustling leaves, just an overwhelming silence. Around 2 a.m., Emily woke up to a strange feeling, an intense, almost primal sense of being watched. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia and tried to go back to sleep. But then, she heard it. Faint shuffling footsteps outside the tent. She froze, holding her breath, as the sound grew louder and stopped just outside her tent. "Guys," she whispered, trying to wake her friends in the neighboring tents. "Someone's out there." Jake, who was sharing a tent with Ben, groggily unzipped the flap and peeked out. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. What the beam illuminated sent a jolt of fear through him. A man was standing just a few feet away. His face was pale, his clothes tattered, and his eyes, they were void of any emotion, staring blankly at Jake. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a statue. Jake's startled gasp woke the others, who scrambled out of their tents. Laura shined her flashlight toward the figure, confirming it wasn't Jake's imagination. "Who are you? What do you want?" she shouted, her voice trembling. No response. The man stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Ben, trying to act brave, picked up a stick and stepped forward. "Hey, leave us alone," he yelled. The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying them, and then, without a word, turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. They stood there in stunned silence, hearts pounding, until Emily broke the spell. "We need to leave. Now." The group hastily packed their things, nervously glancing into the darkness for any sign of the intruder. The sense of being watched lingered as they huddled together, throwing gear into their car and speeding away. At dawn, they reached a small diner in a nearby town and recounted their terrifying encounter to a waitress. She listened with wide eyes and then said, "You're lucky you left. That area's had stories for years. People disappearing, strange sightings. Some say it's haunted. Others think there's someone living out there. Either way, you did the right thing by leaving." When they inspected their gear in the daylight, they noticed something chilling. Fresh footprints in the mud, circling their tents multiple times. The thought that the man had been silently walking around them as they slept was enough to make their blood run cold. The group vowed never to camp in such a remote area again. For years after, they couldn't forget the blank stare of the tent intruder and the sinister realization that someone, or something, had been watching them far longer than they realized. Story 2. The Whispering Wind. Jack had always loved the solitude of the outdoors. A seasoned camper, he often sought the tranquility of remote locations where he could escape the chaos of everyday life. This time, his destination was deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place he had read about in an old hiking guide. It promised untouched beauty, starry nights, and miles of trails. He arrived early in the afternoon, set up his small tent near a clearing, and spent the day exploring the area. By evening, the sky painted itself with hues of orange and purple, and Jack sat by his campfire, enjoying the serenity. As the fire crackled and night fell, the forest became unusually quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Around midnight, as Jack was drifting off to sleep inside his tent, he heard it for the first time. Faint whispers carried on the breeze. At first, he dismissed it as the wind moving through the trees. He told himself it was normal and buried himself deeper in his sleeping bag. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, more distinct. It wasn't just random sounds. Jack could almost make out words, though they were too faint to understand. He sat up, listening intently. Probably just my mind playing tricks, he muttered to himself. Then he heard it clearly. A low, raspy voice whispered, "Get out. Leave now." Jack's heart skipped a beat. His rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the wind again, or his imagination. But the whispers continued, repeating the same phrase over and over, coming from different directions as though the trees themselves were speaking to him. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping into the cold night air. The forest was pitch black, his small beam of light barely piercing the darkness. The whispers didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to encircle him, growing louder and more urgent. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice shaking. No answer, just the haunting whispers. Panic began to set in. He felt an overwhelming urge to leave, as if the very air around him was pressing him to go. He quickly packed his belongings, his hands trembling, and started hiking down the trail. The whispers followed him, echoing through the trees. "Get out. Leave now." By the time Jack reached his car, the whispers had stopped. The forest was eerily silent again, but the sensation of being watched lingered. He drove away without looking back, vowing never to return. A few days later, curiosity got the better of him. He started researching the area online and stumbled upon a chilling revelation. The exact spot where he had camped was notorious for mysterious disappearances. Over the past few decades, several solo campers and hikers had vanished without a trace. Locals whispered about strange occurrences and warned others to avoid the area. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whatever, or whoever, was whispering that night had saved him from something far worse. To this day, he wonders if the whispers were a warning or a test of his will to survive. Either way, he hasn't camped alone since. Story 3. The Unseen Laughter. The Johnson family, Mark, Sarah, and their 2 young children, Emma and Liam, decided to spend the weekend camping by a serene lake in Montana. It was a picturesque location surrounded by dense woods, with the sound of water lapping at the shore providing a soothing backdrop. They pitched their tent near the edge of the lake, grilled dinner under the stars, and shared ghost stories by the campfire. By 10 p.m., the kids were asleep in the tent while Mark and Sarah sat outside, enjoying the peace and quiet. The night was still, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. They eventually retired to the tent, feeling safe and far from the troubles of the world. But around 2 a.m., Sarah woke to a strange sound. At first, she thought it was a dream, but as she became fully awake, she realized it was laughter, soft, high-pitched giggling coming from the woods. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark groggily listened, and his eyes widened. The laughter sounded like children playing, but there was something off about it. The sound was faint, but growing louder, and it seemed oddly mechanical, like a recording being played on a loop. It wasn't natural. Maybe it's other campers? Mark suggested, though doubt crept into his voice. They hadn't seen anyone else for miles when they arrived. Mark unzipped the tent and shined his flashlight toward the woods. The beam illuminated only trees and shadows. The laughter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Shaking off the eerie feeling, Mark zipped the tent shut and reassured Sarah it was probably just their imagination. But moments later, the laughter returned, this time closer. It seemed to come from all directions surrounding them. The couple huddled together, clutching their flashlights, as the sound persisted for what felt like hours. Neither of them slept a wink. At first light, they decided to leave. As they packed up their belongings, Mark walked over to the car to load the gear. That's when he noticed the windows. Small handprints, hundreds of them, covered the glass, as if tiny hands had pressed against the car during the night. The prints were too small to belong to Emma or Liam and were smeared in streaks, as if whoever made them had been dragging their fingers across the glass. "Sarah, come look at this," Mark called out, his voice shaky. When Sarah saw the handprints, her face went pale. "There were no children here," she whispered, gripping Mark's arm. Terrified, they hurriedly loaded the kids and their gear into the car and drove away, leaving the lake and its unsettling mystery behind. Later, they told a park ranger about their experience. The ranger, visibly uncomfortable, admitted there were old legends about the area. Decades ago, several children from a nearby town had drowned in the lake during a tragic boating accident. Ever since, campers reported strange occurrences, laughter in the woods, small handprints, and the eerie feeling of being watched. To this day, the Johnsons don't know what they encountered, but they've never returned to that lake. The memory of the unseen laughter and those tiny handprints still haunts them, a chilling reminder of the inexplicable events in the Montana wilderness. Story 4. The Phantom Campfire. During a summer trip to Yosemite National Park, 3 friends, Megan, Tyler, and Chris, set out on a multi-day hiking adventure. Their goal was to explore remote trails and immerse themselves in the untouched beauty of the wilderness. They carried all their supplies and planned to camp under the stars each night, far from the park's usual crowds. On their second night, they pitched their tents near a ridge with a stunning view of the valley below. After a long day of hiking, they sat around their small, controlled campfire, chatting and enjoying the serenity. Around 10 p.m., they decided to call it a night and extinguish their fire. As they settled into their sleeping bags, Chris noticed a faint orange glow in the distance. At first, he thought it was the moon rising or perhaps a lantern from another group of campers, but it flickered too much, unmistakably the light of a fire. "Hey guys, look at that," he said, pointing through the tent flap. Megan and Tyler crawled out to see. In the distance, through the trees, a fire burned steadily, its light casting shadows on the surrounding area. "Someone's camping over there," Megan said. "Doesn't look like they're being cautious," Tyler added. Yosemite had strict fire restrictions due to dry conditions, and the thought of someone carelessly starting a fire in such a remote area worried them. "We should go check it out," Chris suggested. "Maybe they don't know about the restrictions." The 3 grabbed their flashlights and set off toward the glow, staying on the trail as much as possible. As they got closer, they noticed something strange. The fire didn't seem to grow larger or brighter, no matter how much distance they covered. It remained faint, as if it were always just out of reach. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, they finally reached the area where the fire should have been. But as they stepped into the clearing, the glow abruptly vanished. There was no fire, no smoke, no campers. The ground was undisturbed, with no ashes or signs of a campfire ring. It was as if the fire had never existed. The 3 friends exchanged uneasy glances. "That doesn't make any sense," Megan said. "We all saw it. Maybe we got turned around," Tyler offered, though his voice lacked conviction. They scanned the area with their flashlights, but there was nothing, just trees, dirt, and the stillness of the forest. Suddenly, they heard a faint sound behind them, like the crackling of a fire. They whipped around, but there was nothing there. The sound faded into silence. Uneasy and unnerved, they decided to head back to their campsite. The hike back felt longer than it should have, and the forest seemed eerily quiet, as if the usual sounds of wildlife had vanished. When they finally reached their tents, they climbed inside and spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any unusual noises. The next morning, they stopped at a ranger station to report what they had seen. The ranger listened intently and nodded. "You're not the first to mention this," he said. "That area has had reports of phantom fires for years. Some people say it's the spirits of old campers or hikers who got lost and never made it back." "Lost?" Megan asked, her stomach sinking. Yeah, the ranger replied. There's a legend about a group of campers who were caught in a sudden wildfire decades ago. Some people think what you saw is their fire, replaying like a ghostly echo. The friends left the park the next day, their enthusiasm for adventure dampened. The experience left them with more questions than answers. And to this day, the memory of the phantom campfire lingers in their minds, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that can lurk in the wilderness. Story 5. The Moving Shadow. 5 friends, Sam, Rachel, Daniel, Mia, and Chris, set out for a weekend camping trip in the vast, open wilderness of Arizona. They chose a remote site near the edge of a rocky canyon, miles from the nearest trailhead. The location offered stunning views, complete isolation, and the perfect escape from their busy city lives. The first day was uneventful. They spent their time hiking, taking photos, and enjoying the raw beauty of the desert landscape. As night fell, they lit a small campfire, cooked dinner, and shared stories under a sky bursting with stars. Around midnight, the group retired to their tents, eager to rest for another day of exploration. The stillness of the desert night was shattered around 2 a.m. when Sam woke up to the sound of soft rustling outside. At first, he thought it might be the wind or a small animal, but the sound was rhythmic, almost like footsteps. He nudged Daniel, who was sharing the tent with him. "Do you hear that?" Sam whispered. Daniel groggily listened, then nodded. "Probably a coyote or something," he muttered, brushing it off. But Sam wasn't convinced. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too deliberate. From the other tent, Rachel's voice broke the silence. "Guys, is someone walking around out there?" By now, everyone was awake and on edge. Chris unzipped his tent and cautiously peeked outside with a flashlight. The beam swept across the campsite, revealing only the stillness of the desert and the faint outline of cacti in the distance. "There's nothing out here," Chris said, stepping outside to investigate further. The others reluctantly followed, scanning the area with their own flashlights. The sound had stopped, and nothing seemed out of place. Relieved but still wary, they returned to their tents. Just as they were beginning to drift off, Sam saw something from the corner of his eye, a shadow moving swiftly past the thin fabric of the tent. It was tall, humanoid, and eerily silent. His breath caught in his throat. "Daniel," he hissed. "There's someone out there." Before Daniel could respond, Rachel screamed from the other tent. The group scrambled outside, their flashlights flickering wildly in the dark. Rachel pointed to a tree about 20 feet away. "I saw it," she stammered. "There was someone standing there." They shined their lights toward the tree, but there was nothing there, just the gnarled branches swaying slightly in the wind. Rachel insisted she had seen a tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly still, watching them. Fear took over, and the group decided they couldn't stay another night. They hastily packed up their gear, constantly glancing over their shoulders, feeling as though they were being watched. The oppressive silence of the desert only heightened their anxiety as they made their way back to their cars under the pale light of the moon. The next morning, as they recounted the events over breakfast in a nearby town, Sam decided to do some research about the area. What he found sent chills down their spines. The campsite was near the site of an old mining settlement, abandoned decades ago after a series of tragic accidents. Local legends told of shadowy figures seen wandering the area, thought to be the restless spirits of miners who had died under mysterious circumstances. The group couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something beyond explanation that night in the desert. Though none of them could prove what they saw, the memory of the moving shadow and Rachel's vision of the figure behind the tree lingered, a haunting reminder of the unseen presences that may still roam the Arizona wilderness. Story 6. The Abandoned Backpack. Derek and Liam, childhood friends and avid hikers, decided to spend a weekend camping in a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest. The forest was known for its dense foliage, towering trees, and its eerie, almost otherworldly silence. It was the perfect spot to escape from their busy city lives and reconnect with nature. On the second day of their trip, after setting up their camp near a small creek, the two friends ventured off the beaten path to explore the surrounding area. As they walked through the thick woods, they stumbled upon something unusual, a backpack lying in the underbrush. The backpack looked weathered but not old. Its zippers were intact, and it didn't appear to have been exposed to the elements for long. Curiosity piqued, Derek unzipped it. Inside, they found neatly folded clothes, a partially eaten pack of trail mix, and a map of the area. The map had markings and notes scrawled on it, as if the owner had been planning a route. "Looks like someone was here recently," Liam said, glancing around the woods. "But where are they now?" Derek asked, a note of unease creeping into his voice. They scanned the area but saw no signs of a campsite, fire, or even footprints. The stillness of the forest felt oppressive, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. As they stood there, a sudden and overwhelming feeling of being watched washed over them. It wasn't just paranoia. They both felt it, a tingling sensation at the back of their necks. The hair on their arms stood on end. "Let's get out of here," Liam said, shoving the map back into the backpack and dropping it where they had found it. The two hurried back to their campsite, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. They spent the evening trying to laugh it off, convincing themselves it was just their imaginations running wild. But deep down, neither of them truly believed it. That night, they were awoken by a faint sound outside their tent. At first, they thought it was an animal rummaging around, but as they listened closer, they realized it sounded like something being dragged across the ground. Derek reached for his flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sitting directly in front of their tent was the backpack. Liam joined him, and they both stared at the bag, their minds racing. They had left it miles away, untouched in the spot where they'd found it. And yet, here it was, as if it had followed them back. "Someone's messing with us," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. Derek stepped out cautiously and shined his flashlight around the campsite. The forest was silent and still, but the feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice echoed through the trees, unanswered. Neither of them could sleep the rest of the night. They sat in their tent with a hatchet and a hunting knife at the ready, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. When morning finally came, they decided to leave immediately. Before they packed up, Derek cautiously examined the backpack again. This time, it was empty. The clothes, food, and map were gone. They hurriedly broke camp and hiked back to their car, constantly looking over their shoulders. Once they reached safety, they reported the incident to the park rangers. The rangers listened patiently, but weren't surprised. "That's not the first time we've heard about something like this," one ranger said. "There have been stories of people finding items, backpacks, tents, even shoes, and then those items showing up again later, almost like they're being returned." "Returned by who?" Derek asked, his voice shaky. The ranger shrugged. "No one knows. Some people say it's the spirits of those who got lost out here. Others think it's just a really twisted prankster. Either way, I'd steer clear of that area if I were you." Derek and Liam never returned to that forest. To this day, they can't explain how the backpack ended up outside their tent or why its contents vanished. All they know is that something or someone was watching them in the woods that weekend, and it still haunts them to think about what might have happened if they had stayed. Story 7. The Silent Forest. A group of 5 friends, Sarah, Ethan, Mia, Jake, and Olivia, decided to embark on a camping trip deep in the Rocky Mountains. They were seasoned campers, familiar with the wilderness, and looked forward to a weekend of hiking, stargazing, and sharing stories around the fire. They chose a remote spot miles from any trails, relishing the isolation. The first day was perfect. They set up their tents, explored the surrounding area, and enjoyed a hearty dinner by the campfire. As the night deepened, the usual sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional hoot of an owl, provided a soothing backdrop. Exhausted from the day's activities, they decided to turn in around midnight. But as they zipped up their tents, they noticed something strange. The forest had gone unnervingly silent. The comforting hum of nature had vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. "Do you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered. "Or don't hear," Jake replied, his voice uneasy. At first, they tried to rationalize it. Maybe a predator was nearby, scaring off the smaller animals. But the silence felt unnatural, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. They huddled together around the dying embers of the campfire, unwilling to go to sleep. Then came the footsteps, loud, deliberate, and heavy. They circled the campsite, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. The group froze, their flashlights darting around the perimeter, but they saw nothing. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, as if someone or something was stalking them just beyond the reach of the light. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a few moments of dreadful silence, the footsteps resumed, this time quicker, darting around the campsite erratically. It was as if whatever was out there was taunting them, staying just out of sight. "I don't like this," Mia whispered, clutching Olivia's arm. "This isn't normal." Just as panic began to set in, Sarah gasped and pointed her flashlight toward the tree line. "There," she whispered urgently. The beam illuminated two glowing eyes in the darkness, bright, reflective, and unblinking. The eyes were set far apart, at a height that suggested whatever was watching them was much larger than any animal they'd encountered before. "Is that a bear?" Jake asked, though he didn't sound convinced. The glowing eyes vanished as suddenly as they appeared, and the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, even more suffocating than before. Without another word, the group decided they couldn't stay another second. They quickly packed their essentials, leaving behind anything that would slow them down, and began hiking back to their car in the dead of night. The entire way, they felt as if they were being watched, though they never saw the glowing eyes again. When they finally reached their car at dawn, exhausted and shaken, they drove straight to the nearest ranger station to report the incident. The rangers listened, but didn't have an explanation. "People report strange things in those parts sometimes," one ranger admitted. "Unexplained noises, figures in the woods, things they can't describe. We always chalk it up to the wilderness playing tricks on tired minds." But he hesitated. "There are some places even the rangers avoid." The group never returned to the Rockies, though they've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, an animal, or even a prank. They can't forget the glowing eyes, the oppressive silence, and the feeling that something in that forest didn't want them there. Story 8. The Screaming Wind. In the heart of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota, a group of friends, Liam, Sophie, Matt, and Sarah, set off for a weekend of camping and canoeing. The Boundary Waters, known for its pristine lakes, dense forests, and quiet solitude, was a popular destination for outdoor enthusiasts, and the group had been planning this trip for months. They were excited to leave behind the noise of the city and immerse themselves in nature. After setting up camp by one of the remote lakes, they spent the day paddling, fishing, and enjoying the beauty of the wilderness. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirp of a night bird. The air was cool, the sky filled with stars, and the group felt completely at peace. But that peace was soon shattered. Around 11 p.m., the wind picked up and a strange, unsettling noise reached their ears. At first, it was faint, a soft, high-pitched wail, almost like the cry of a child in the distance. The friends paused, looking at each other in confusion. "Did you guys hear that?" Liam asked, his voice edged with unease. Sophie frowned. "It sounded like someone's yelling. but far off, like a scream. They listened for a moment, but the sound had faded. They shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind or an animal in distress. But as the night wore on, the scream returned, this time louder, more distinct, and more chilling. It seemed to be carried on the wind, echoing through the trees, distant but unmistakable. The group fell silent, staring into the darkness around them. The scream grew louder, shifting from a shrill cry to a guttural and human sound, deep and filled with pain. It was as though the forest itself was crying out in torment. "We need to check this out," Matt said, standing up from his seat by the fire. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What if it's something dangerous?" Liam nodded. "We can't ignore it. It might be someone in trouble." The friends grabbed their flashlights and cautiously made their way toward the woods, following the direction of the sound. The wind howled around them, but they couldn't pinpoint where the screams were coming from. It was as if they were being carried on the wind, swirling around them from all directions, growing in intensity with each passing minute. They searched for over an hour, walking deeper into the woods, but found nothing. No sign of a person, no animal, nothing that could explain the terrifying screams. It was as though the source of the sound was deliberately hidden just beyond their reach. The group returned to their campsite, shaken as the scream continued to echo faintly in the distance. They sat around the fire, too unsettled to speak. The air felt thick with tension, and none of them could shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The scream didn't stop, but instead seemed to grow more frantic and filled with anguish as the hours passed. As the night deepened, Sarah spoke up. "This place, there's something wrong about it. I've heard stories. My uncle used to camp here when he was young, and he always told us to avoid these woods. He said the screams, they're from a vengeful spirit." Liam turned to her, eyebrows raised. "A spirit?" "Yeah," Sarah continued, her voice low. "Local legends say that there's a spirit in these woods, a woman who died tragically, alone, and in pain. Some say she was murdered, others say she drowned. But either way, her spirit is restless. They say her screams can be heard on the wind when the conditions are right, like tonight. Some believe she's looking for revenge for what happened to her." The group sat in silence, the weight of Sarah's words hanging in the air. The wind continued to howl, and the scream, now a low and mournful wail, seemed to echo all around them. No one wanted to admit it, but they all felt it, an unease, a primal fear that gnawed at them. As the night dragged on, they tried to sleep, but the screaming wind never stopped. The sound seemed to seep into their very bones, growing louder and more intense with every passing hour. Finally, just before dawn, the screams suddenly stopped. The friends, exhausted and frightened, packed up their camp as quickly as they could, their nerves frayed from the sleepless night. They left the boundary waters behind, feeling as though they had narrowly escaped something they couldn't understand. When they returned to the town, they spoke to a local guide who had heard of the stories. He didn't say much, but nodded gravely when they described the sound. "The spirit is real," he said. "People who hear the screaming wind are marked by her. Some say she follows them, even after they leave the forest." The group never returned to the Boundary Waters, and though they tried to push the memories of that night out of their minds, they couldn't escape the lingering sense of dread that followed them. The screams that were carried on the wind still echoed in their thoughts, a reminder of the vengeful spirit that haunts those woods. Story 9. The Rock Thrower. A group of 4 friends, Ryan, Emma, Tyler, and Zoe, set out on a camping trip to the remote wilderness of Canada, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. They had chosen a secluded spot deep in the forest, miles away from any trails or civilization. Their campsite was nestled near a small, tranquil lake surrounded by towering pine trees, a perfect place to disconnect and enjoy nature. The first day went smoothly. They set up their tents, explored the surrounding woods, and spent the evening around the campfire, laughing and enjoying each other's company. As the night settled in, the sounds of the forest filled the air. Chirping crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. They crawled into their tents around midnight, exhausted from the day's activities. However, around 3 a.m., they were suddenly jolted awake by a loud bang, followed by another crash that seemed to come from outside their tents. It sounded like a rock had struck something hard, followed by the deep thud of something heavy hitting the ground. "Did you hear that?" Ryan whispered, his voice shaky. "Yeah," Emma replied, already unzipping her tent. "It's coming from over there." The group cautiously peeked outside, scanning the dark forest with their flashlights. The night was eerily still, and there was no sign of any animal or person. The air felt thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. They strained their ears, listening for any movement, but all they heard was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Suddenly, another rock was thrown. This time, it hit the side of their tent with a loud crack. The force of the impact was enough to send a shiver of fear through them all. They jumped back, hearts pounding in their chests. "Who's out there?" Tyler shouted, his voice filled with panic. No response. The forest remained silent, save for the occasional whisper of the wind. They waited in silence, hoping for an explanation, but nothing came. After a few tense minutes, they decided to venture out of their tents to investigate, shining their flashlights through the dark underbrush. They found nothing, no person, no animal, and no evidence of any disturbance. "Maybe it's just a bear or something," Zoe suggested nervously, trying to rationalize the situation. "Bears don't throw rocks," Ryan muttered, his voice shaky with fear. They returned to their tents, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The night passed in fits and starts, with the occasional bang or crash coming from the woods, but no further sign of what was causing it. The noise never seemed to get any closer, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. They barely slept, jumping at every sound. When the first light of morning finally broke through the trees, they emerged from their tents, bleary-eyed and exhausted. But as they surveyed the area around their campsite, they saw something that chilled them to the bone. Huge footprints left in the soft earth near their tents. The prints were massive, far larger than any humans, with deep impressions that suggested something heavy had passed through the area during the night. The shape was unmistakable, broad, flat, with long toes and a distinct arch. "Those aren't bear tracks," Emma said, her voice trembling as she examined the prints. "What the hell made these?" Ryan crouched down, running his fingers over the edges of the print. "I don't know, but these are huge. Way too big for a bear." They followed the trail for a short distance, but it quickly disappeared into the dense woods. The group was left with more questions than answers. Later that day, they spoke to a local ranger who listened carefully to their account. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his tone low and serious. "You're not the first ones to experience something like this," the ranger said. "There have been reports of strange occurrences in these woods, rock throwing, strange footprints, and other unsettling things. Some people think it's just wildlife, but others," he hesitated, "others think it could be something else, something bigger." "What do you mean?" Tyler asked, confusion and fear evident in his voice. "The stories around here go way back," the ranger continued. "There are old tales about creatures in these woods, large, elusive beings. Some people think they're Sasquatch. Others call them wild men. Whatever they are, people say they're protective of their territory." The group exchanged nervous glances. Sasquatch. The thought seemed impossible, but with the massive footprints and the unexplained rock throwing, they couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something unusual had occurred. They didn't stay much longer. The unease that had settled in their bones was too much to ignore. They packed up their campsite in a hurry and left the wilderness, feeling as though they had narrowly escaped something they couldn't fully comprehend. Back home, the group found themselves researching local legends, trying to make sense of the strange events they had witnessed. They came across numerous reports of similar experiences. People hearing rocks being thrown, finding large footprints, or feeling a strange presence in the woods. Some swore it was a bear. Others believed it was something far more mysterious. The experience stayed with them, a chilling reminder of the vast, unexplored wilderness and the creatures that might call it home. Whether it was a bear, Sasquatch, or something else entirely, they couldn't be sure. But they never returned to those woods, and they would always wonder if they had encountered something truly extraordinary, or if it was just the wilderness playing tricks on them. Story 10. The Missing Camper. In the rugged, remote wilderness of Utah, a man named Thomas Phillips set out for a solo camping trip, hoping for a peaceful escape from the pressures of daily life. An avid hiker and outdoor enthusiast, Thomas had always loved the solitude of the desert, and this trip was meant to be a week of reflection and relaxation. He chose a secluded area in the Utah wilderness, far from popular trails and campsites, to ensure complete solitude. Before leaving, Thomas promised his family that he would keep them updated throughout his trip. He sent them messages every few hours, telling them about his hikes, the beautiful sunsets, and the wildlife he encountered. His messages were casual, almost lighthearted, filled with details about his days, and everything seemed completely normal. But then, on the fourth night of his trip, something strange happened. Thomas sent his usual evening check-in message, letting his family know that he was sitting by his campfire, enjoying the warmth and quiet of the desert night. But the next morning, there was no message. His family thought it was strange, but assumed that he had simply gotten busy with something or fallen asleep early. However, by late afternoon, when they still hadn't heard from him, concern began to grow. They tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. His family grew increasingly worried and decided to contact the local authorities. A search party was quickly organized, consisting of rangers and volunteers familiar with the area. When they reached the spot where Thomas had set up camp, they found his tent intact, but empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything had gone wrong. His backpack, clothes, and belongings were all present, neatly arranged as though he had just stepped out for a short walk. But Thomas himself was nowhere to be found. The search team scoured the area for days, combing through the vast and rugged landscape. They searched on foot, by air, and with tracking dogs, but there was no trace of Thomas. It was as if he had simply vanished without a trace. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no sign of him leaving the campsite, nothing. The search eventually slowed down after a few weeks, but Thomas's family refused to give up. They hired private investigators and even brought in additional search teams, but it was to no avail. Months passed, and still, no one knew what had happened to Thomas. He had disappeared without a single clue to explain his disappearance. Then, nearly 6 months after Thomas's disappearance, a breakthrough came in the most unexpected of ways. A group of hikers, deep in the same wilderness where Thomas had been camping, came across an old camera partially buried in the sand. At first, they thought it was just some discarded gear, but when they picked it up and examined it, they realized it was still functional. The camera was dusty, but it appeared to be in good condition. Upon looking through the photos on the camera, they made a chilling discovery. The first few photos were of Thomas smiling, sitting by his campfire, looking relaxed and content. It was clear from the images that he had been enjoying his time in the wilderness. There were shots of the sunset, of his camp setup, and even a few self-portraits with the desert landscape behind him. But the last few photos were much more disturbing. The last image on the camera was a photo of Thomas asleep, lying on his back in his sleeping bag inside his tent. The image was eerily still, with the dim light of the campfire just outside the tent casting shadows on his face. But what made the photo chilling was that it wasn't taken from inside the tent. It was taken from outside, through the mesh of the tent's window. It looked as though someone had been watching him as he slept. The hikers, uneasy about the discovery, immediately contacted authorities and Thomas's family. The camera was turned over to the police, and they were able to confirm that it belonged to Thomas. The final photo, taken in the dead of night, seemed to be the last clue left behind in the mystery of his disappearance. Despite the police's continued investigation, no further leads turned up. The question of who took the final photo, or whether Thomas had been aware of someone's presence outside his tent, remained unanswered. There was no sign of any struggle, and no one else had been reported in the area at the time. It was as though the camera had been left behind by someone who had been watching him, but why they took the photo and then vanished without a trace was a mystery that could not be solved. The case of Thomas Phillips remains one of the most puzzling disappearances in the Utah wilderness. His family, still searching for answers, continue to hope for some resolution, but no one knows what happened to Thomas or why he disappeared so suddenly. As for the camera, it offered no new answers, just a haunting final image of a man alone in the desert, captured by an unseen observer. The disappearance of Thomas Phillips remains unsolved, a chilling reminder of the unpredictable and mysterious forces that can lurk in the wilderness.